Hello, hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're watching us. Thank you for joining us today, where we're going to be talking about migrating IBMI to the cloud, looking at some of the pros, some of the cons of doing that. My name is Haley Vyas. I'm a product marketing manager here at Precisely. And with me today, I have Dan. He's our product manager for our IBMI HA solutions. Just before we go ahead, some housekeeping notes for us. We're coming to you live, so we're streaming live. If you're having any technical issues with the audio or video, please use the Q&A box to the right of your screen. Once you do that, someone from our team will be in touch with you and we can troubleshoot. Since we're also recording, please don't feel the need to take screenshots or any notes. You will receive a copy of the deck and the recording in your inbox so that you can send it to anyone from your team who couldn't be here. And please use the Q&A box to put in your questions at any time during the presentation. Dan and I will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the deck. We likely won't get to all of them, but if you put in your questions, we will reach out to you after this if we can't get to it. So I encourage you to type that in. With that being said, migrating IBMI to the cloud. So this webinar topic is really born out of a lot of conversations that we've been having with customers who are considering what it really looks like to move to the cloud, right? Like, should they move? What are the advantages, disadvantages? What are they actually going to have to go through? So in order to help frame some of those discussions, make everything like come together, we thought this was a conversation worth having. Here's what the next hour or so is going to look like. We want to talk a little bit about where you're at when you're considering a move to the cloud. Like, what are the things that are probably most top of mind? What are you trying to get out of it? What are the advantages you're hoping for? And what are the things you're worried about or should be worried about? And then we'll talk about the actual process and how Precisely can help with that migration. And then we'll go through what it actually looks like to operate Power Systems in the cloud, which kind of expands the conversation a bit beyond just IBMI to also include AIX, which we're seeing more and more of on Power Systems. So that being said, let's begin with what's probably going on in your mind or your company's mind, department's mind, or even your manager's mind, right? About making this move. Cloud is obviously not a new concept, right? And we don't want to imply that this is some unproven technology. But what is relatively new is the momentum on the IBMI side specifically. The cloud has really started to become a genuine alternative mode of deployment for IBMI workloads in roughly the recent past. And customers are getting super creative with how they're approaching it. And it's usually not all or nothing. It's kind of not everything goes to the cloud or nothing goes. It's not that kind of situation, right? There's typically a hybrid approach, and there are a lot of different ways to structure our IT environment to help us do this. And we all know, we're not a stranger to this, that one of the special issues here with IBMI is that the critical nature of the applications and data that live on our Power Systems, right? These aren't systems where you can just take them offline for a week and then slowly move everything to the cloud and then figure it out as we go. The mission critical, business critical nature of what's running on our IBMI is what makes this a particularly pointed conversation. And that's really the thread that you'll see runs through everything Dan and I are going to talk about today. So talking about what are the things that actually push people towards this. Now we'll walk through this one by one, and you'll see that a lot of these sound familiar. Moving to new hardware is a big one in our world, right? Power 11 is out there now, and the performance is impressive. A lot of people are still on Power 9 or Power 8, and they want to get to Power 11. And when you're already going to migrate to new hardware, That's a natural moment to ask yourself, to take a pause, ask yourselves, should I be doing that in conjunction with a move to the cloud? So that's something that we're seeing now. There's a generally accepted belief, and it's not true in all cases at all, but there's money to be saved by moving to the cloud. The flexibility and elasticity of how you can set up workloads can lead to lower costs for our IBM environment. It's not automatic though. We still need to do our homework on that. Collaboration is another one. Being able to make workloads, applications, and data available to people all across your organization in the cloud, it can open things up in ways that are hard to do otherwise. And probably one of the bigger ones is people are thinking about is flexibility and agility. So if you've got seasonal demand spikes, for example, you can scale up in the cloud without buying new hardware and then scale back down when you don't need it. So that elasticity is genuinely valuable and useful. Now, security, and we'll go into this more later. Security is interesting because you can actually argue it both ways. Because if it's done right, the cloud can be very secure. But if it's done wrong or without thinking it through, then we're creating new vulnerabilities, and we'll touch on this more as we go through this. And then remaining remote work, reduced on-premise infrastructure footprint, always up-to-date software, improved backup, and of course, disaster recovery options, more predictable budgetary spending. All of these play in, and they have been. So the bottom line is these are all things that cloud has always promised, and they all apply to IBM I and our power system space. Now that we've talked a little bit about what these benefits are, we have to ask what are the pros and what are the cons? And we'll spend a little bit of time on the cons because I think they're worth being more honest about. On the pros side, everything that we just spoke about, right? Cost savings, scalability, accessibility, the agility, automatic updates, reliability, and improved collaboration. All of these are the ones that consistently rise to the top in surveys and publications. And these are the reasons that people pursue this. But these same studies have also pointed to things on the right side over here. Security concerns. And we want to be clear, like moving data outside of your four walls, outside of your data center, it does create a higher degree of vulnerability. We think, we think, and we do believe it's manageable and mitigable if it's done properly. But we do have to think about security in a more holistic, expanded way when we move to the cloud. It's definitely not a reason to not do this. It's just something that we have to take seriously. Vendor lock-in is also real. When we pick a cloud provider and migrate our data, we're making a commitment, right? Switching later is not painless. So that's another thing to think about carefully. Limited control. So when that IBM power system is sitting in your data center, you have physical 24/7 access. Depending on our relationship with a provider, that can change, that can vary, but it's a consideration again. And then hidden costs, right? This is one we've actually seen bite customers. Bandwidth requirements in particular can be super underestimated. If your applications aren't performing the way that you need them because your pipeline can't keep up and you end up having to spend more on bandwidth than you planned, that can seriously erode those cost savings pretty quickly. And then compliance is also another one. In some industries and some parts of the world, we simply cannot move certain data to a public cloud. Healthcare, financial services, some international data residency requirements. These are real constraints that we need to understand before we make any moves. With with all of this, we can now look at specific IBM I information. So there are a lot of reasons to migrate. And actually, what's changed in the last couple of years is that the options for doing it have expanded tremendously. You don't have to build it yourself. There are managed hosting providers, public cloud providers, IBM, Google, AWS. We work with virtually all of them, and we have a whole partner network of people doing this. There are now a lot of good options for IBM workloads in the cloud. And the hardware inflection point that we talked about before, say if you're on Power 7 or 8, support from IBM is expiring or becoming more limited in some of those spaces. That is a real reason to think about migrating. And pent up demand for Power 10 or Power 11 now is also real. So some companies upgrade every generation, some skip a cycle or two, but there's definitely a wave of people who have been waiting. And here's the honest part of the conversation, right? As many benefits as there are to getting to the cloud, the act of getting there can be a real challenge. Justifying the investment, because this is not free, right? It's an invest money to save money kind of model. In an uncertain business environment, this isn't always easy. And the scale and complexity of an IBM migration is significant. IBM does impact everything else in our environment. So the integration requirements are very real. The migration workload and risk is real. That's what the next slide is all about. Um, we we have done surveys of IBM I professionals about this, and these are just some numbers that we thought were good to share. The kind of eye-opening, really. And these aren't numbers like we put on here to scare you guys. They're just the reality of what people are experiencing when they try to do this. So 60% of our respondents said that they delayed migrations because of concerns about business disruption and downtime. And that concern is legitimate. These aren't systems that we can easily take offline. 46% spent over 50 hours just to plan and execute their last migration. That's over 2 full days of work. And more than a quarter, more than 25% of them said that it took over 100 hours. So we're talking potentially a week or more of execution time. That is a very significant barrier for a lot of organizations. And then when we look at that 44% said that their migration caused 6 or more hours of downtime. And 26% said longer than 13 hours. So when we sit down to do the math on what an hour of downtime costs for a typical IBM customer, we take into account all the lost revenue, productivity, everything that stops. This can easily get into hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that we know is not an insignificant number. And then there's the last one where we see that 31% experienced a serious migration failure. The most common failure was being unable to restart critical applications within the time that they had, within the required time frame. So they essentially had to roll back to where they started. Almost a third of people who try to do this themselves, they had to go back to square one. And that's a little scary number. So the point of sharing this isn't to say don't do it. The point, in fact, is to say that we need to go into this with our eyes open, do the planning, and work with people who actually know how to do this. So you're not one of those statistics. Now, having seen that, what does it actually cost when things go wrong? We hear that quite a lot, that question. And there are the obvious ones, right? The labor costs of having to restart, the capex, financing costs of the migration itself, direct and indirect labor. But the less obvious ones are the ones that really add up. Downtime cost is the obvious one from the previous slide, right? But it's more than just lost revenue. It's the operational cost of everyone being stopped, of your customers not being served. Security exposures, right? While you're in the middle of a migration, if you haven't got your security configuration right on the new system, then we've created a window of vulnerability. That's very real. And lastly, regulatory costs. This this one we want to be specific about because we've dealt with customers who've experienced this firsthand. In a lot of compliance frameworks, it's not just that you're out of compliance and get a warning. You're out of compliance and you get a fine. If you're a bank and your customers could not access their accounts for a period of time, in many countries that triggers a compliance fine. Full stop, period. That's a tangible financial cost and not just a theoretical risk. So when you're considering the move to the cloud, this is not something that we can take lightly. On the other hand, and this is really the pivot point, with the right partner, the right planning, and the right tools, you can minimize these risks dramatically. And that's what Dan is going to walk us through next. So, Dan, all yours.
All right, Haley, thank you very much. And thanks for setting us up here to talk about what it actually might look like a little bit in the cloud. So I'm going to spend some time talking about actually operating in the cloud. And for this webinar here today, we're going to talk primarily about power systems now, and namely IBMI and AIX. So at Precisely here, we have solutions for operating on IBMI. We have the Assure Mimics, Itera, Quick EDD softwares, and for AIX, we have the Assure Mimics for AIX. Now, of course, AIX and IBMI are a little bit different, but we can, generally speaking, we're talking about logical replication for those platforms, and a lot of these same concepts apply, okay? So if you have any questions around that, just let us know. But the cloud itself, running power systems, are virtual environments. So IBMI and AIX is running on virtual LPARs configured via cloud software consoles. So the public cloud provider is going to provide you an interface so that you can configure your cloud virtual machine, or LPAR, if you will. You get choices whether to install IBMI or HA. And it's not IBMI or AIX. It's not about the hardware. It's about the LPAR. So your LPAR will run on different hardware within the cloud. Of course, each public cloud provider has rules and policies and procedures, but you're mostly just working within your LPAR. And what can happen as part of those policies and procedures, that the serial number that you have very likely can change. Whereas that's different when you own your own hardware. You have dedicated hardware that typically doesn't change unless you're going to do an upgrade. You might see things like virtual serial numbers and virtual tiering, which I'll talk about that in a minute. You have limited access to hardware peripheral devices like tape that you were used to before. And you really don't have access to the hardware anymore. So Haley was talking about the pros and cons and things. That might be an advantage and it might be a disadvantage, right? So you don't need to deal with the hardware anymore, but you don't have access to it anymore either. So the other thing to consider as you move to the cloud is that performance fundamentals still very much matter, right? Whether your application is running in cloud or on-prem on your own gear or at a hosted provider, your application is the most important thing here. And it demands a certain amount of resources depending on what your business drivers are. So you have to make sure, no matter where you run your application, that you have a optimally tuned environment. And so cloud LPARs must have underlying processor memory and storage resources to support the application processing requirements. Some more basics. When it comes to software licensing, um, your vendors that you work with have to accommodate these cloud operating environments. So remember, the LPARs are mobile, live partition mobility events may occur. So like the cloud providers will vacate a power system, right? So they'll move you to a new power system, and um, that could change things for you, right? And that's why there's the thing called virtual serial numbers. IBM provided that. Not everybody's using that, but that that is really the reasoning for that. So if you're not running virtual serial numbers, then physical serial numbers will change and hardware features will change. And so if your licensing is tied to that, then that's something you're going to have to deal with your third party vendors. So in the cloud, it's really, we're moving into a capacity oriented world now with the cloud. It's less about the system attributes and the number of CPUs, and it's more about the capacity. So, you've probably heard the term CPW, per commercial processing workload, and that is a capacity metric. So, whether you're running one CPU on a Power 10 or one CPU on a Power 11, you have a different amount of capacity there. The compute capacity that you have on a Power 11 is going to be greater than a Power 10. So that's what you need to consider, and that's why the capacity works well in the cloud. Now, one other thing, I've been talking about public cloud providers or cloud providers, but there's a lot of really excellent managed service provider companies out there as well that operate and provide offerings for uh, customers who would like to run IBM I or AIX in a hosted environment. So what they do is they provide an additional layer of service. Oftentimes they provide IBM I expertise, whereas maybe one big contrast between the managed service providers and the public cloud providers is that the public cloud providers really just provide you a infrastructure as a service. So the LPAR is going to be running and it's going to be there, but you're kind of on your own when it comes to managing your environment, the actual OS and things like that. We'll talk more about that a little bit. So I mentioned these virtual serial numbers, and it's worth spending a little time on that. We're starting to see more emergence of this. They have been out there for a few years now, not new, but I would say not widely adopted, but we're definitely starting to see more of this out in the marketplace. So let's talk about what a virtual serial number really is. A virtual serial number is a globally unique serial number for a virtual LPAR. Remember, the LPARs in the cloud are virtual. And so you can now identify an individual LPAR with a virtual serial number. So that didn't used to be the case. We could only identify an individual LPAR by the machine serial number plus the LPAR ID. With virtual serial numbers, now you have a virtual serial number specifically for the LPAR. So this LPAR can move across multiple power systems with differing machine serial numbers. It allows for software licensing to be tied to a serial number that is mobile, along with the capacity, such as in the cloud or multi-tenant computing environment. Also, this is something brand new, is virtual tiering allows virtual LPARs to have a lower software tier, or you might know it as a P group, than the power system itself. I have some examples of this here. So for up here, we have a power system that's serial number A111. That's your machine serial number, and then it's a P30 class box, right? And so here, though, we have an LPAR running on that, which is a virtual LPAR and it has a virtual serial number. So you can see that here. Typically, virtual serial numbers start with a V, although I'm not going to promise that won't change. IBM may change that someday, but if you look at this LPAR, it's running at a tier of P10. but it's running on a P30 power system. So that's an example of virtual tiering. That's relatively new. So that allows service providers to operate at a fewer power systems and use more capable power systems, but offer individual customers lower software tiers. And that matters when it comes to licensing and things like that. I have 4 virtual LPARs in my example. Here's another one. This one's running a P05 tier on a P30. This one's the same thing except on a P20. And this one is the same thing except a P10. So you might say, well, these 2 LPARs are running at site 1. These 2 LPARs are running at site 2 within the cloud, if you will. So that gives you your geographic separation. So back to the list here. If you have virtual tiering, it must have virtual serial number. So that's a rule. And then so what you can do, of course, with Assure Mimics is you can replicate across from one virtual LPAR to another with both have virtual serial numbers. So the next slide is where it really gets interesting. So this one moved over here, right? So as I said earlier, the cloud provider sort of vacated that serial number A1 machine and moved everybody over to B2 or somewhere else so that they could do some firmware maintenance or whatnot on that power system. And so the beauty of this virtual serial number is that that's a seamless move. You're not having serial number changes. You're not breaking your software, license keys, and all that kind of stuff. So virtual serial number is very handy. And hopefully I expect to see a lot more of this coming in the future. The other thing to think about within the cloud is that physical tape devices are really scarce in the cloud. Okay, now there are some VTL options. Of course, you can use virtual tape if you're savvy enough to do that, which is great. You can do a save to a IFS object, but doing a full system save and things like that is really less practical. Now, they do have in some of the cloud providers the ability to clone an entire LPAR, which is really great. That's a definitely an advantage of being in the cloud. So, but of course you can do flash copies on premise and things like that. But just doing a regular old save is you can, if you're used to doing a tape save, you have your own tape device and you're jockeying tapes around. You're not going to be able to do that so much in the cloud. So you want to check that out and make sure that you understand what you're getting into there. But the other thing is that the way you load the LPAR may be a scratch load, right? So some of the cloud providers provide these templates. So you might say, well, I want a template that is at OS 7.5 technology refresh for example, and that's what you get, but that's a scratch LPAR, right? So then you're going to have to bring over everything and make sure you're taking care of it. The other thing is the OS maintenance work, like PTFs and things like that, is typically done by the end user, unless you have the managed service provider doing that on your behalf. So full restores, I mentioned, may not be possible. Shipping tape is impractical. So what you can do with these logical replication solutions like Mimics is you can start up the scratch installed LPAR and bring everything over through the network. So that's a sync by wire technique. You can use the advantage of time and sync up that LPAR while your production is still running where it is now. So we have highly flexible options here when it comes to logical replication for both AIX and IBMI. So we can support all kinds of different variations, right? So you might say, well, gee, I got this type of a power system on-prem. I've got this type of storage. I've got this OS level. But I really need to go to the cloud, and I also need to upgrade to a higher OS level. That, of course, is going to be different power systems, different storage, everything else. So what about that? Well, the logical replication solution supports all that. We can handle, any type of storage. We support different operating system levels, although I don't recommend you stay at different operating system levels long, but we can support that, and you can migrate and transition to new OS levels. We do that all the time. It's a great solution. And of course, it has a go back option, right? So if you find out that you're at the wrong OS level and it's not your application is not running well, we have seen this. You can go back to the old one. So highly flexible capability here between the ground and the cloud and so on. So that's the basics about the cloud environment that you can think about. And let's now transition to actually doing the migration into the cloud. So the key to this is that you're basically getting the cloud LPAR ready to go in parallel with your production system. So you continue to run. We call it while active. We have a lot of different while actives, right? So this would be a migration while active. We also have other things like save, backup while active, application upgraded while active, encrypt while active, compress deleted records while active. So here we're talking about migration while active. So what we're going to do is all changes are replicated to the new system in real time, and that gives you a target system, in the cloud that is available to you to start testing. And you can test that all out before making the switch. And users on the production side, we leave them alone. They continue running the business. And again, we're going to use time to our advantage. So you can get all this ready to go, get in sync. We call it switch ready, and then cut over at the planned time. So we can cut over in minutes, right? It's almost a non-event. You just bring down the application on one side and bring it up in the cloud. And of course, you've already tested that because you got tooling and things like that to test it to make sure it's ready to go. So uh, the Migrate While Active solution for IBM Ion AIX provides high volume, large size, high number of LPAR capability. And we also precisely has experts here available to help you with migrations. So, this just shows you're going from anywhere to anywhere, and that would include the cloud. It includes different OS levels and different hardware types and different LPAR configurations. So it covers data applications, critical objects, and variation there. Now, I always advise people to control their variables, but sometimes you can only keep everything identical so much, and you need to make a jump. Like, for example, let's say you're at 7.4 and you want to upgrade to 7.5. That's very doable. But that's one variable, right? Just the fact that you're going from one power system to another. They might be completely different power systems. That's a variable. You're going to a different network. You're operating over a different network. That's a variable. Of course, the cloud is a completely different operating environment. That's a variable. So then you might have applications people who say, well, gee, we want to make some changes to the application during this process. That's a variable, right? So control your variables, but you can do things like that to really minimize your downtime and risk. So how does this thing work? All right, so logical replication enables a synchronized pre-production migration target. So migration target LPAR and sync real time with the old prod. So here's our old production system, and we're going to new prod. So we're really going, Think of this as a complete system. That's a production and DR or HA environment right there. The production environment is made up of two LPARs in this depiction. And over here in the cloud, you're reproducing that production environment, which is a new set of uh, pair of systems, right? So you're going from old to new, and you might only replicate from old prod to new prod, but then the new prod to the new backup is replicating within the cloud. Now, another way to do it is you go like this from old to new, but you also then go from old prod to new backup. That's another approach. So there's different ways to do migration approaches here. Um, and that's where you just work things out and have a good approach. And again, we provide some advice and recommendations and help with that if needed. So once you get replication all set up, then you need to verify. You need to achieve what's called switch readiness, and that's where our audits come in, and you can validate down to the bit level that you're in sync. You can do that while active. So if your database is changing 10 millions of times an hour, that's fine. We have our audits work with that. Then we have something called the virtual switch, so you can test it as many times as you want to. Matter of fact, you might want to set this all up and just test this uh, new environment ahead of time before you even set up the replication from old to new. That's also a very good idea. You can do switching in there and make sure everybody, application load testing. I highly recommend that kind of stuff. That's just goodness to do. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's continue. So one thing we have been doing migrations and helping customers migrate to new environments for a long time here at Precisely. We've learned a thing or two. We've gotten pretty good about it. And it's all about managing the risk and downtime. And to further help customers do this, we're actually adding something called migration mode. And what it is, it's an operating mode that you can toggle into and just say, okay, I'm going from A to C here, and I just want to, that's a migration, right? I'm not switch ready yet. But over here, I am in steady state, right? That's my current production HA environment. So I need to leave that alone. I need to maintain switch readiness at all time. So while I'm building the C node, I need to leave the A to B replication pair alone and unharmed. So the migration readiness mode toggles in. So what you would do is you would toggle in to the migration mode for the A to B pair. And we basically set it in an appropriate way to recognize that this is not a steady state environment. So we turn off things like Target Journal Inspector. We disable the audits. We have scheduled synchronization control, steady state mode. The steady state mode, like when you toggle back out of migration, go back to steady state mode, that all those settings are still there, ready to go. So we're also adding new synchronization queues. So this is something that's coming and mimics. It's going to make migrations even better. So once you finally get to your switch readiness, of course you need to test it. So there's the environment, you want to test that out. You want to test your security, your data integrity. A lot of this can be done with our audits, but certainly customers will look at that. They'll run reports and make sure their reports balance and all those types of things. Application verification testing and user acceptance testing. So that's all just standard procedure, making sure that your new application is ready to run in the new environment. So just summarizing this, migration to the cloud, the migrate while active minimizes downtime, manages or eliminates risk. And of course, we have a wide, highly flexible infrastructure choices. Works very, very well with all these different combinations. We're seeing anything from 7.6 going to the cloud, OS 7.6 And I've even got old 7.1 systems, maybe even a 6.1 that I've seen going to the cloud. So, there's a wide variety of things out there. You don't have to be on the cutting edge of OS and IBMI to go into the cloud. So you would work with your cloud provider and make sure that they can support that OS level. And then here at Precisely, we certainly have a logical replication solution that would support that level, and we can get the migration done. Now, I'll just throw in one little bonus here to think about. And Haley asked us to talk about the cloud here today, and you can actually use the cloud for cyber resiliency. So you don't even have to put your production and backup systems in the cloud. You can leave them alone on your on-prem. You might have good reasons to do that. Like Haley mentioned, there might be some regulatory reasons why you don't want to put your production in the cloud. But you can certainly set up the cloud and take advantage of its elasticity for a preparation for cyber resiliency. So this picture here shows how we can basically send these objects, if you will, immutable journal receivers. We could take advantage of cloning technology that I mentioned earlier and scalable object storage in the cloud to solve the problem of cyber resiliency. So also available coming in Mimics is a CDP technology that will allow you, if you were to take some kind of corruption, whether it be malicious or accidental, you can rebuild your production database up to the point of corruption. And you could do this in the cloud. So you could establish a cyber resiliency position and plan where you're doing it in the cloud. And so you can recover your database there and have that be part of your plan. So that's something for you to consider. This is an emerging thing that we're starting to see with this cyber resiliency, and we are being definitely asked by customers of what options they have. So they're starting to plan for this. This is not the only way to do it. It's just that we're talking about cloud here. You could certainly do the same thing on-prem on a separate LPAR, or even on some of the LPARs you already have. So it's just one other thing to consider. The cloud opens this up. And what's really cool about the cloud is it does have this cloning and scalable object storage that you can store stuff as part of your plan. So that's pretty much what I got here, Haley. So I'll flip it to the Q&A and back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. That was good. I did see a couple of questions coming in, and I know we're like pushing time, but we'll try to get through two or three. Um, the first one is Migrate while active only available to existing Mimics customers?
Okay. Well, if you have Mimics already, you probably already have a configuration that you can use to migrate, right? You have a configuration that's optimized for your application, and hopefully you're switching and doing switch and stays and things like that. You can use that very same configuration to migrate to the cloud or an MSP environment. Okay. If you don't have Mimics, then you can certainly get Mimics, and you just have to build that. And as long as you asked, we are also really focusing on building the configuration much simpler. So look for that to come. It's going to be easier to build a configuration. We're going to allow you to simply protect the library, and then Mimics will go and figure out all the journaling that is in place or not in place, and can build a configuration for that library. So you can do that for multiple different libraries. So no, you do not have to have Mimics. You can get Mimics from us. We sell bridge licenses for it and services to help you. So that's definitely an option.
Great, awesome. Thanks, Dan. Second one we'll do is there's a question: do I need physical access to the hardware to use Migrate while active when moving to the cloud?
So even if you, so no, you don't need it and you're not going to get it, right? So you typically in the cloud, you will have a, call it a cloud stack, okay? It's a GUI interface that the cloud provider gives you. You log in and you interact with that. And within there, you can create your LPARs and build environments and things like that. You can start them and you can stop them. You can increase and decrease capacity from those cloud stacks. So that's how you would interact with your LPARs, but you don't have access to the hardware in that case. So you would work with the cloud provider to set up the networking and the LPARs, and then also, if you have to connect your on-prem with the cloud provider, they would help you with that. So you have to have, if you're going to migrate into the cloud, or maybe use the cloud as a DR solution or a cyber resiliency solution, you will have to have a connection, a network connection to that cloud, and you'd work with the cloud provider for that.
Got it. Yeah. Thanks, Dan. And since we can only do one more, I think, let's do this one. It's an important one. What does it actually look like if I try to migrate and something goes wrong?
Yeah, so maybe you find out that you missed something, or maybe what can happen, we've seen happen, is the application runs great on one OS level, but not so good on a newer OS level. It didn't have handle the load, or it didn't do this, or it didn't do that, and you find out this just isn't going to work, and you miss that in your testing. So sometimes it's hard to reproduce those things until you actually do it. So that's one of the beauties of using the Assure Mimics or the precisely HA solutions, is that you have a go back option. So if you've cut over to, let's say, a higher OS level, or even if you didn't, you find out the cloud LPAR is just not working, you're replicating in reverse. So you start out, let's say you're on LPAR A is on-prem and LPAR B is in the cloud. You're replicating from A to B, and then you find out it didn't work on B. You switched over to B, you find out it didn't work. Well, now you're replicating from B to A, so A is still intact and still in sync. Now, if you made some business transactions, A has them. So you just do a control switch back to A, just like you did a control switch to B. And now you're back on A, and you can figure out what went wrong and mitigate that and try again.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. So I know we're at time, but that's all we have for you today. We do have some questions unanswered, so we'll get back to you via email. Please look out for your for the recording and deck in your inbox. If you have any other follow-up questions, please feel free to get in touch with us. You can just head over to our website and put in your details. Someone from our team will be in touch. And thank you for being a great audience. We hope to catch you in the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.